Welcome everyone. For all those who came from places far away, my heartfelt thanks. I'm delighted that you are all here, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you, and not least those who have added to their specialist academic interests in the matters that we're about to discuss. Another element of motivation, namely that of showing support for the Central European University as we pass through the very difficult period in which we are passing at the moment, and which is announced here in the badges that some of you have been wearing. As you know, the Central European University has been under siege for about a month. The government, with very pronounced fascistoid elements within it, have designed a law whose ambit fits the situation of the Central European University perfectly, made to measure in order to make it difficult for us to operate in any normal sort of way. We've had a tremendous amount of support from all over the world. We've had political support from all over Europe, including from the Council of Europe and from the European Commission and from the European Parliament. We've had support from a variety of very high-ranking politicians, many intellectuals and academics, including the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft and quite a number of other similar institutions from all over. We've had support from political support from the US State Department as well. And this has been, in a certain way, difficult as it is, something of a boon, in that we at the Central European University had been rather well known among a small select group of cognoscendi, and now we have entered the annals of universal fame. So thank you very much to the Hungarian government for this service that they have rendered us. Yet, difficult circumstances notwithstanding, we are working as usual. We are working as usual. We are keeping our normal level of activity active as it always has been. And I'm really happy to welcome you all on behalf of the Central European University. I would very much have liked the rector to come and address you, but of course these are extraordinary circumstances, and I did not think that it would be fitting for me to approach him at this particular point in time. Thanks very much to Alba Fedeli. Thanks to Alba for her counsel, expertise, engagement, and unstinting help in looking after the scientific aspects of organizing her conference. Thanks very much to Esther Holbrook, who is the coordinator of the Center of Religious Studies, with whom most of you corresponded. She is the mainstay of the Center for Religious Studies, and I thank her very much for her dedication and her exemplary organizational flair. Many thanks to Stefano, who is a CRS, that is to say a Center for Religious Studies intern, who has been unstintingly and exquisitely helpful. This has been really a wonderful team working all together with thoroughly positive energy, a congenial bundle of three right hands for me. So thank you very much to all of you. Now, this conference, as you may know, is a joint effort. It belongs to all those who made it possible, and I should also like to thank the Central European University's technical IT team, who are always a decisive presence, albeit almost always equally invisible. Thanks, of course, to the Fritz Thyssen Stiftung for their generous financial support that has made this conference possible, enhanced by our internal Central European University funds. I also welcome very much the keen interest shown by the Biblioteca Ambrosiana, and I'm sorry to say that the Vice Prefect Monsignor Fumagalli has been unable to come due to an unforeseen obligation in China at the present moment. I'd like to also mention and to express thanks for those who would very much have wanted to be with us, again, not only academically, but for reasons of solidarity. I should like to mention Professor Van Es, who was unable to come at the last moment for an urgent personal circumstance, in fact, a family bereavement. For Professor Stefan Wild, who was also unable to come, and at the last moment because of a family illness. And last but not least, from Harvard to Shadi Nasser, who has been unable to come because of problems with obtaining a Hungarian visa. Now, the idea of mounting this conference came up immediately, almost automatically, when we appointed, or rather, if I might say so, plucked Alba Fedeli from Birmingham as a postdoctoral fellow at the CRS, of which I was director at that time. And together with the Institute for Advanced Studies at CEU and its director, Professor Nadia Al-Baghdadi, a plan for this conference was prepared with Alba's help, and an application submitted to the Fritz Thyssen Stiftung. I should like to convey the apologies of the present director, my successor as director of the Center for Religious Studies, because he is abroad at the moment, and I should also like to thank him for his continued support of this particular undertaking. And I should also say that we here noted Alba and attracted her before she became so extremely famous. With her work on the 2 leaves of the Mingana collection at the Cadbury Library in Birmingham, dated with 94% probability to between 568 and 645. There is an even earlier datation for some of the fragments that are being studied in Paris at the moment. Now, this is an academic conference with some technical discussions to come, but it is not entirely apolitical. The situation of the CEU at present is directly correlated to politics, and both what the CEU can and what it cannot do are also connected with politics. But so also is the Paleo-Qur'ānic Manuscripts and palimpsests, which will be discussed tomorrow and on Saturday. I would have wished that we had invited someone to discuss the reactions to Alba's discovery, for instance. Some very interesting, some wonderfully bizarre reactions might well have been analyzed very profitably for us. There is a politics of acquisition of manuscripts and a politics of access. There are networks of circulation, networks of silence and secrecy and occlusion, and a political economy of resources. There is much hedging, both gingerly and ungainly. All of these are involved in the study of palimpsests and early Paleo-Qur'ānic manuscripts. I do not think that any of you will be surprised to hear this, nor of the mention of open secrets, secrets known to most, although some might be surprised that this particular matter is in fact aired in public. Related to both the scientific and political character of the theme of this conference is what appears to be a tribal drift that research into this field seems to have taken. Strong loyalties and interests, hidden sympathies and antipathies. More often than not, people of well-defined groups do not read works published by others or do not cite them. And I have not infrequently witnessed a preference for not reading at all to reading material published by outsiders. There are exceptions, of course, such as Professor Angelika Neuwirth, who reads everything as a matter of course, whom we had hosted here at CEU, but was unfortunately unable to join us on this occasion. Now, given the setting, interesting stories might be written about the provenance and availability and circulation of Paleo-Qur'ānic manuscripts in light-hearted moments. There is fact and fiction relating to Sergio Noia Noceda's collection, to his villa, to his next-door neighbor, the foundation bearing his name. And I look forward to what Ambassador Boffo and Alba Fedeli will be telling us about this tomorrow, and of course to Efim Rezvan, who is also in a position to enlighten us in this regard. Engaging stories might be told about manuscripts collected by Bergstresser and said to have disappeared from Munich during the Second World War. Also of goings-on in Sana'a, Paris, Saarbrücken, Munich, Berlin, Lago Maggiore, and elsewhere. And stories about widows and lawyers and clandestine contracts, intimations of academics, not so much intimating that academics are not so much monastic as Jesuitical. Such stories can be quite entertaining, and there is more than one tribal saga that can be written about any of these manuscripts. Some of these stories have a cloak and dagger character. Many have genre-specific character with a whiff of the adventures of Tintin. So, we sought to do something else. We sought to bring many interested parties, groups as well as individuals to meet in one place and talk about things, research that they do in common. Asma Hilali and Benham Zadeghi were invited, both accepted, and both then had, for particular unforeseen circumstances, were not able to come. Incidentally, they are the only ones who have seen fit to unpack and publish the Sana'a palimpsests, still kept under heavy guard. We shall all be looking outwards to this conference, and I hope that we shall also go on to consider the implications of technical research for the broader purposes of the history of the Quranic text. This field has seen intense application and much progress in the past 2 decades. These are very interesting and potentially most promising developments, and a number of large-scale research enterprises are in place, and we shall be hearing about some of them tomorrow. This work will put us in a position to have a consequential recognition of a complex history, a paleographic, codicological, and textual history, and indeed of a social history, during a period when the Quran was still largely in a pre-exegetical stage of development, still a scripture in statu nascendi, still circulated only very fragmentarily, and for long circulated most sparsely, before the professionalization of book copying and book selling under the Umayyads, under the Abbasids. All this bespeaks the neologistic prefix Paleo, as in the Paleo-Quran. This prefix was first suggested and developed in detail in a book entitled The Emergence of Islam in Late Antiquity, published in 2014, where an argument, a very elaborate argument, was made for the term Paleo-Islam and collateral phenomena such as Paleo-Muslim, Paleo-Muslim scripture, and to designate not only a temporal station, but also an historiographic category of objects that required a sui generis treatment without the retrojection of issues arising in later circumstances. In the case of Quran, exegesis, for instance. I am gratified that the prefix is gaining circulation and that there is officially designated a Paleo-Quran project supported by major scientific agencies, with which our distinguished speaker today is involved. And I remember keenly discussions of this prefix in conversation with Christian Robin in 2013 in my apartment at the Maison Sugère over a particularly good bottle of Burgundy. And then quite a number of things have happened since, and the term is gaining greater and greater currency. Now, the Paleo-Quran as a sui generis text, viewed as it grew rather than in light of what it later became, is one important historical conclusion of the sort that I hope we shall be addressing in the closing session of this conference. The Paleo-Quranic text is the sum total of its performances, that is my view, both oral and written, on parchment as well as on coins and engraved on rock, the two feeding into each other with complex feedback loops. It is a process, spiral rather than linear in structure. Hence, the idea of a digital edition, which is being proposed by Alba Fedeli. This is, in my view, the historically very similar Paleo-Quran, without presuming any archetype or original. The very concept of an original text in these circumstances is rather more complex than many are willing to admit. And, given what we know, is indeed an unnecessary explanatory and interpretive hypothesis. This is one crucial dimension of what is often vaguely referred to as the materiality of the text, that the text does not exist outside the physical object which is its support, or outside the physical arrangement of its textual components. Talk of materiality brings me to this conference and to our keynote speaker, Professor Francois Deroche, member of the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres, Chevalier de la Légion d'Honneur, and Commandeur des Palmes Académiques. For the past 3 years, professor at the Collège de France. An almost natural culmination to a royal progress, starting with the Lycée Henri IV, leading on to the École Normale Supérieure, and from then on to the Institut Français d'Études Anatoliennes in Istanbul, where he broke himself in as he worked on manuscripts from the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, held in Istanbul. Then on to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, where he catalogued Quranic manuscripts and prepared the Codex Parisano-Petropolitanus for publication, and the École Pratique des Hautes Études, where, among other things, he directed study on the methods of history, the history of art, and archaeology. What other name comes to mind so automatically when one is concerned with the issues of interest to this conference? As we were discussing who it should be who would deliver the keynote address to this conference, Professor Deroche's name emerged of its own accord almost, an almost natural choice to speak synoptically to our theme. Francois Deroche, who has done so much to make possible the kind of work that is to be presented in this conference. His work might mark the precise expertise as well as by versatility. Now, of his many books, there is a little gem which few people read. It's called Le Coran, published in 2005, a very small, extremely interesting, very engaging book, published in the Que sais-je collection in Paris. Now, I had read this before I had read his Islamic codicology and his various contributions to restituting the earliest Paleo-Qur'anic texts. It was this precious little book that stimulated my interest in the Quran as a physical object, to be quite honest. One whose materiality has generally been little noted, and whose materiality is, I have now come to realize, an integral part of its history, an element without which the text will be a bubble, not an historical object. Francois Deroche pioneered and accomplished much of the careful hard work required even to start working seriously on Paleo-Qur'ānic manuscripts. In the 1980s, cataloging the extremely important collection held by the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and for the first time, and after a gap in Quranic manuscript studies from the Second World War to around 1980, he gave us an organized and classified body of materials in basically chronological order which scholars of all tendencies need to consult. He gave system to the enterprise. There is no other way for describing a manuscript than using paleographic and codological types created by Deroche, and he even gave names to certain paleographic variations within the Hijazi script. In 2009, he applied his matchless knowledge and paleographic expertise and his extraordinary access to publishing the Codex Parisano-Petropolitanus, but also for an analysis of this text. What is likely is that the combination of paleographic and analytical expertise will propel forward activities in which Deroche has been involved, the Corpus Quranicum and the Paleo-Quran project aimed at studying manuscripts from one specific location, that is to say, the texts of Al-Fustat. For now, Professor Deroche proposes to enjoin us to write in the name of the Lord. Uktub bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. This might have the air of a mu'arada, but of course, historical research itself is perpetually in the mode of mu'arada. Thank you very much.
So I would first like to thank the Center for Religious Studies and the Institute of Advanced Studies of the Central European University for the invitation to take part in a conference that will address a topic that is so dear and important to me, as you can imagine. And I also would like to thank you, Professor Al-Azmeh, for the invitation and the nice words you just said about myself. I was feeling a little bit ashamed to hear that, because I'm sure that my contribution is far from being so important. I would like also to thank Dr. Alba Fedeli, who has been energetically promoting this conference, and Ms. Esther Olborn, who supported my coming here with many problems, but we did that. It would have been a dream, my dream, to attend such a conference about 40 years ago, when I was beginning the study of the collection of early Quranic manuscripts at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. I remember vividly both my amazement and my bewilderment as I discovered little by little these manuscripts that are the topic of this meeting, but seemed then to have been completely forgotten by scholarship, to such an extent that finding information about their peculiarities was often impossible for me. Sitting in an office that I shared with some curators of the Department of Oriental Manuscripts, or the old reading room of this department, in this building that you see on the screen, I was overcome by the richness of a production that I only knew through Nabia Abbott's study, which was my reference work, but soon proved to be absolutely inadequate to tackle the topic in spite of its own merits. However, I felt quite alone when I was trying to explain the problems I was facing to scholars who had simply no idea of the material, and sometimes flatly suggested that it would be better for me to leave what they saw as a hopeless task. Over the last 4 decades, the early written transmission of the Quranic text has become the focus of much attention, and various research projects are currently underway in this field. The manuscripts themselves are becoming easier to access, and the same can be said of the sources relevant for any research on the history of the Quranic text. It would be, of course, misleading to state that no attention was ever paid to the early copies of the Quran. From an early date, they were included into the topics Muslim Quranic scholarship discussed according to its own agenda. The account about the copy of Malik ibn Anas's grandfather has been brilliantly analyzed by Michael Cook and shows that in the 8th century, scholars were using the written text. According to Ibn al-Qasim's text, he died in 806, the text preserved by Ibn Rushd the Elder, the father of the famous Ibn Rushd, Malik and a group of students were looking at specific places in the manuscript. A scholarly tradition, exemplified by Ad-Dani, died 1052, seems to have carried out some kind of analysis or survey of early copies of the text. The Andalusian scholar wrote about copies attributed to Osman in what can be seen as an attempt at taking into account the written transmission of the Quranic text in order to establish properly the rasm, the consonantal ductus. This had become an important issue since in post-Ibn Mujahid scholarship, the Osmanic rasm was one of the criteria for valid reading that could be deduced from the treatise of Ibn Mujahid himself. Actually, Ad-Dani refers in his works to the Masahif al-Amsar, although he fails to provide a clear definition of what he was exactly meaning by that designation. According to the procedure implied by the direct observation, ru'ya, his wording is sometimes ambiguous when he deals with the Masahif of Iraq and Baghdad. Actually, As-Sakhawi, died 1245, noted later in a treatise about the Rasm that Ad-Dani's statement concerning his observation of some Masahif, if not even all, was not convincing and could be an opinion, not an observation. Ad-Dani refers, for instance, to the orthography of Bi'ayatina. He writes that he saw it with only 1 year after the alif in most Iraqi copies. Sahawi took up this point and noted that the orthography described by Ad-Dani was probably a deduction and not an observation, since as-Sahawi observed that in all the copies he could examine, the orthography was with 2 years, as in the manuscript on the screen. Research was actually difficult, and the identification of the relevant manuscripts that could constitute the body of evidence could not rely on precise criteria. Information about the places where such items were kept was difficult to get anyhow. When one was found, the medieval scholars faced the problem of dating early Qurans well before Adolf Gorman started to write his well-known paper. Colophons were obviously a piece of evidence that early scholars could rely on. But even if at that moment, that is to say in the 11th or 12th centuries, some of the early copies were still in a relatively good shape, colophons were probably not very common on the earliest manuscripts. Ad-Dani's quotes actually one of them, but it dates from the 8th century, and we have no example from an earlier date except for some fakes. What would amount to a traditional paleography was not precise enough to enable a classification of the early written tradition, and if we can judge from the so-called Qurans of Usman that began to appear in the 12th century, like the one on the screen, any copy written in an old script of good quality, thus excluding Hijazi, could qualify for this status. If we look at Ad-Dani's contribution, we can wonder whether he took the written transmission seriously. As-Sahawi, in many instances, seems to have had a more precise idea of, and his account of the peculiarities of the early transmission of the text is indeed far more accurate. Ad-Dani always favors the riwaya, the oral transmission, when there is a discrepancy between it and the masahif. When, according to the tradition, 2 different orthographies are found in the manuscripts, but only one is observed on the latter, he will decide in favor of it. This could actually be his way of working, giving the priority to the riwaya and to the copies that confirm its statements. Scholars like As-Sahawi or Ibn Najah, died 1103, were more prone to take into consideration the information provided in the written transmission, but in the end, Ad-Dani was the one who had a lasting influence on later Quranic scholarship. In the West, the early codices were not contemplated for a long time for a very simple reason. The material of this kind was not found in any European collection, with the exception of a handful of items. In the second half of the 18th century, Jakob Georg Christian Adler, who was above all a biblical scholar, was a pioneer in this field as he analyzed a few Quranic manuscripts kept in Copenhagen. He was actually facing 2 major difficulties. The first one was the date of the copies he used. They can be roughly dated to the 9th century. The second one was the lack of precise information about traditional Quranic scholarship. The situation changed with the French expedition to Egypt and the acquisition by collectors, then by public libraries, of a fair number of early Quranic fragments, primarily from Fustat. They became available for research in Europe since the first half of the 19th century. However, Western scholarship tended to disregard the evidence available in spite of 2 attempts at taking into account seriously the early written transmission of the Quranic text, one by Michele Amari and the other one by Gotthelf Bergstresser. The findings of the former were not properly published. The latter was responsible with Otto Pretzl of the second edition of the Geschichte des Korans and devoted a few pages to some observations about the manuscript tradition. However, Bergstresser's untimely death and the interruption caused by the Second World War brought the development in this field to a halt until the 70s. In the second half of the 20th century, Three developments modified deeply the approach of this material. In 1973, the discovery of a cache of old worn-out fragments of the Quran below the roof of the Great Mosque in Sana'a opened new avenues for research as the sensational circumstances of the discovery and the contents drew the attention of a larger audience. Two items were particularly significant. A few leaves of a folio copy with magnificent illuminations that could be dated to the Umayyad times, and 40 leaves or fragments of a palimpsest. The former has been quickly published and shown in exhibitions. Rumors soon started circulating in the press about the latter and the text it contained, reputedly different from the canonical version, but it was not published until recently. A few years later, in 1977, a second event helped giving the Quranic manuscripts more importance. In his Quranic studies, John Swansbrough concluded that the Quran as we know it today was actually compiled by the end of the 8th or beginning of the 9th century. This was actually not the main issue of a book that offered a new understanding of the Quran and of its genesis, but it was nevertheless important as this dating was part of the reconstruction offered by Swansbrough. In the aftermath of this publication, counter-arguments were sought in various directions, and the early manuscripts were one of the elements adduced in defense of a dating to the middle of the 7th century for the writing down of the Quran. Slightly later, the paleographic categories in use until that moment were challenged following a comprehensive study of the Jean-Louis Asselin-Chervil collection in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Strangely enough, whereas the study of the text itself had for a long time developed without paying much attention to the data collected by the Muslim tradition, in matter of scripts, the approach was largely, if not exclusively, based on these sources since Adler's times. The observation of the scripts, although at the beginning limited to the Parisian collection, containing manuscripts mostly from Fustat, resulted in a typology that is clearly not the last word in this field, and I insist on that, but help, I think, identifying smaller groups of copies within a material that had been perceived until then as a hopeless heap of scattered leaves. The conjunction of these three unrelated developments certainly helped changing the vision of this handwritten material. Until that moment, even if we take into account the studies I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, it had been conspicuously absent of the researches on the first 4 centuries of Islam carried out by art historians or Islamologists alike, which of course means that we have to ask a first question: are the Quranic manuscripts of the first centuries of Islam so important? In view of the limited evidence that has come down to us, any artifact from this period is in itself important. But how should be rated the testimony of the manuscript with the sacred text of Islam that can be dated to the first decades of its history? We can perhaps appreciate a situation from another perspective. Numbers and comparisons are not a safe and clear answer to the question asked, but they may help us in our evaluation. As I said before, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France houses a large collection of Quranic fragments collected in the beginning of the 19th century in Fustat by the French Arabist Asselin-Chervil, plus a small number of items from various provenance that I will not take into account here. The Asselin collection itself contains a very large number of leaves, but more significantly, documents the presence of about 250 copies of the Quran in the Am Mosque in Fustat. The 250 copies, dating from the 7th to the 10th centuries, are not complete for various reasons. Some of their folios were destroyed by natural or human causes, some were taken away and are now preserved in other collections around the world. And of course, Aslan Chervil could only select what he could look at in the deposit. In the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the preserved witnesses from Fustat range from an isolated folio, for example, Arab 348J, to 279, which is the case of Arab 351. So, wide discrepancy between the various items in the collection. They show, anyhow, that at some moment, 250 copies with the Quranic text, either in a single volume or in multi-volume sets, were found within the mosque. Actually, the number was even higher, since some manuscripts are known only through fragments kept in other collections and not in Paris, and since some items must have disappeared completely. In the storerooms of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the items originating from Fustat are housed close to the library's collection of Latin manuscripts that contains a fair number of Carolingian Bibles and New Testaments produced roughly over the same period as the Fustat Qurans. A survey of these manuscripts shows that 70 volumes are concerned. They were collected over many centuries and originate from a variety of places, mainly in France, but also from outside France. The imbalance between the two is striking. The copies of the Quran are more than 3 times more numerous in the Parisian library than those with the Christian scriptures, although the former were once kept in a single place, the Mosque in Fustat. And if we compare the latter with the Carolingian library that remained more or less intact through the centuries, that of St. Gallen in Switzerland, the difference is still more pronounced, since 39 Carolingian manuscripts with biblical contents are found in St. Gallen, but only 1 with both Bible and New Testament. This formal observation leaves aside other issues, of course, as the use of the manuscripts, the patronage, and so on, but challenges the idea that the written transmission was not relevant in Islam. The mere investment in money and effort they imply is simply as enormous as this manuscript of the Quran implies. It took me some time before I realized that the Fustat collection of all Quranic codices amounted to a library, or, as I decided to label this kind of collection, a Bibliotheca Qur'anica, similar to those that are found in Damascus, Sana'a, or Kairouan, containing from a few thousand folios to more than 200,000 folios. As we know them today, they are more like genizot, that is to say, deposits of worn-out manuscripts that could not be left without care for reverence sake. Previously, during their heyday, before the 11th century probably, the copies were either scattered in boxes distributed in various places within the prayer hall, as was the case in Damascus, or grouped within an enclosure, a maksura, as in Kairouan. Taking into account the number of Quranic manuscripts in such libraries, they were not properly libraries, but I shall use this name, it is actually amazing that this large body of evidence was never seen as a major source for the history of Islam from its beginning to the early Abbasid period. The massive evidence about the state of the Quranic text has no parallel, and it is an incredible piece of luck that we can follow so closely its evolution during that period thanks to a continuous written transmission. But it can also provide a considerable amount of information about the cultural history of Islam. The answer to my question is now obvious. Yes, the Quranic manuscripts of the first centuries of Islam are very important and deserve to be examined carefully. They amply show that the believers considered that the book, not only the scripture, was important, and, as the title I chose for this talk is supposed to suggest, felt the need to have the Quran transcribed again and again. For obvious reasons, the earliest layer of the handwritten transmission has been the focus of the attention. But the documentation contained in these deposits covers a larger period than the first decades of Islam. It would be unwise to discard the possibility that textual peculiarities could not be found in later copies, and they should be examined as carefully as the Hijazi fragments. Hassan Shadi noted, for instance, in his study of Bibliothèque Nationale Arabe 335, a fragment that can be dated to the first half of the 8th century, that in the Quran, Surah 2, Al-Baqarah, verse 137, the text read, I will, فَإِنْ أَمَنُوا بِمَا أَمَنْتُمْ بِهِ, instead of the text which appears below in the Cairo edition, بِمِثْلِ مَا أَمَنْتُمْ بِهِ. It is obviously not an omission, as the fragments reads bima and not ma, as would be the case if the copyist had forgotten to write bimithli. The case is that the reading fa'in amanu bima is known to be a variant transmitted by Ibn Mas'ud and Ibn Abbas. The interesting point is that the rest of the text found in the Parisian fragment is in accordance with the Uthmanic rasm. This example is probably not unique and suggests that the approach to the text was somewhat flexible at a rather late date, and actually we know that Malik was recommending Abbasid authorities to prevent the copying and sale of the version of Ibn Mas'ud in his times. So there was still a tradition at that moment. As most of the material preserved in these Geniza-like deposits predates the canonization introduced by Ibn Mujahid, its study may shed light not only on these kind of situations, but also guide our understanding of the evolution of the Qira'at's diffusion at grassroots level and of the reception of the 7 readers. Examining closely the later manuscripts that have shared for centuries the fate of the earliest ones in these deposits should be a priority for further studies. Any progress is, however, hampered by the lack of a survey of all this material. A comprehensive study, a comprehensive catalogue, or at least a precise repertory of the fragments would be therefore a most welcome contribution to these researches, and I am sure that this is now an evidence for all the scholars involved in these studies. Most of the manuscripts and fragments are concentrated within the 4 deposits I just mentioned, that is to say, Damascus, Sana'a, Fustat, and Cairo. They are unevenly explored or reconstructed, and part of their original holdings, mainly isolated folios, are scattered among many collections, private or public, that are not always easy to reach. A survey of the early manuscripts of the Quran should not only aim at them, but also attempt to identify the many manuscripts and fragments that were never part of these 4 large deposits and escaped our attention because they were kept in countries or places less accessible for research. It will be sufficient here to mention how our knowledge of the Iranian collections is changing thanks to the efforts of scholars like Mortezi Kariminia. Huge progress has been made in establishing the chronology of the early manuscripts of the Quran. However, dating remains one of the main challenges we are facing, even if much progress has been accomplished since the publication of Groman's paper, The Problem of Dating Early Qurans. The reason has certainly to do with the state of the material, mostly made of codices that were left without care in these deposits, so that the stitches that held the bifolios and the quires together decayed, and the manuscripts were often reduced to fragments. The folios most exposed to damage were those on which various notes that may have provided dates may have been found. And even when a date is directly mentioned, as is the case of this manuscript from the Egyptian collection, or can be deduced from a note, one has to be very careful regarding its relationship to the manuscript. The paleographic typology resulting from the study of the Bibliothèque Nationale collection was only a first step towards dating and its progress depends on the discovery of new fragments with the date. The 9th century and the later period will probably mostly benefit from any new discoveries since, as we all know, the early period has been so far extremely poor in dated items. The recent development of C14, and this is a tribute to Alba Fedeli, the development of C14 analysis of the parchment proved an alternative to this lack of dated material and has provided important clues. However, the interpretation of the results seems to me still problematic, and the time span covered by the results of an analysis is usually too long for our needs. The pace of the changes the Musaf underwent during the first century of its history is so high that the accurateness of the dating should ideally be within the 10-20 years range to sort out the sequence of the events. Anyhow, whereas the chronology is becoming increasingly precise, the place of origin of the copies still eludes us. Researchers should be devoted to this question. To this date, no significant result has been reached, and attributions to an area are either based on mere hypothesis or on the confusion between the regional variety of the qira'at found on a manuscript and its place or copy, or between the latter and the place where the manuscript itself has been found. The identification of a manuscript's components by physical analysis might shed some light on this issue, but this process will take much time. Any research has, in addition, to take into account the possible movements of the manuscripts and, of course, of the copyist, from the Masaif al-Amsar themselves to actual fragments kept in Paris or Damascus. There is plenty of evidence pointing to a mobility of the Musafs produced until the 9th century and beyond, of course. Anyhow, the scientific analysis of the material itself, from the identification of the ink to the date of the parchment, and perhaps one day the reading of the DNA of the animals used for the preparation of parchment, have complemented the results of codicology, and even if the body of results is for the moment too small to allow conclusions about the provenance of the manuscript, they already provide the codicologist, the paleographer, or the art historian with answers about specific problems. Researchers on the text itself are also concerned by this. The progresses in imaging have started to be associated to such investigations, even if success is not always assured, as was the case for David Powers and his work on Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Arabe 328. For the moment, however, scholars are mainly exploring directly the manuscripts, and it is now less infrequent to see them integrated into publication about the Quranic text, like this encyclopedia of the Rasm recently published by Bashir al-Himyari in Saudi Arabia, where you see that small bits of photographs from the text of a manuscript are integrated into the printed version. That this material is now taken into consideration is certainly a great change and should encourage us in pursuing our researches on the early Quranic manuscripts. They are still at an early stage and depend largely on the availability of the information, a point I shall address later. It is true that at this initial stage of the research, the results seem fragmentary when compared with what has been done in the field of codicology or paleography. However, the growing number of publications about the history of the text, as it can be grasped through these early and direct witnesses, shows that something is happening. Once more, evidence has become accessible. The contribution, once more evidence has become accessible, the contribution will modify our understanding. The problem of the transmission, and I avoid here the word stemma because I think it's tricky, is of course of prime importance, and even if, once more, the results are limited and should be seen as provisional, they indicate clearly that some progress is underway. The Lachmanian model is certainly not working for this kind of research. Other hypotheses are investigated. Eleonore Sella suggested, for instance, on the basis of a group of 8th century copies within the same variety of script, that certain circles either deliberately maintained and even introduced archaisms, or that various exemplars were used simultaneously by a copyist. The relationship between the oral and the written transmission and the modification it may have caused should, of course, be taken into account in such investigations. The palimpsest of Sana has obviously benefited from its fame if we can judge by the comparatively high number of studies it has elicited. In addition to the papers published by Elisabeth Pouin, the publication by Benham Sadeghi and Mohsen Goudarzi, and the forthcoming book of Asma Hilali throw some light on this fascinating and complicated document. I shall come back to it slightly later, but I wonder actually if we are not starting to see the beginning of a specific field of investigation around the palimpsest itself. Researchers on the early manuscripts of the Quran benefited greatly from the increasing availability of texts either dealing with the Quranic sciences or with any subject linked to this field. The field covered is wide, since it includes studies on the history of writing down of the Quran, like those by Achal Motsky or Viviane Comero, on specific aspects on the transmission, or even information about the text preserved in diverging traditions. The edition of the treatise of As-Sayyari about falsification of the Quran by Ethan Kohlberg and Ali Amir Moisi provides, for instance, new materials about non-canonical variants, mixed, of course, with Shia-oriented readings that need to be evaluated carefully. The huge body of the variant readings kept by the Muslim tradition has also been made more easily accessible by the publication of various encyclopedias, as well as of medieval treatises dealing with more specific treatises, topics, and so on. Shadi Hekmat Nasser's analysis of the emergence of the canonical qira'at represents, in this respect, an important step towards a better understanding of this field, although it prudently leaves aside the highly problematic beginnings of the qira'at transmission. The Muslim tradition contains important elements for the history of the text in the beginnings of Islam, although the attention it paid to the materiality of the codices is unfortunately scarce. However, this information can serve as a basis for the understanding or the reconstruction of important phases, as a glance at Omar Hamdan's Studien zur Kanonisierung des Korantextes will show. I mentioned previously Cook's study of the Musaf of Malik's grandfather, but I should also evoke his attempt at reconstructing the stemma of the Masaif al-Amsar on the basis of the information provided by the tradition. However, in most of the cases when we have to deal with these studies, they fail to take seriously into account the real material that might, in most cases, complement nicely the data kept by the Muslim tradition, or critique it, but they cannot be separated completely. Anna's copy has not been preserved, and if it survived, I'm not sure that we would be able to identify it because it probably had no colophon. But slightly later manuscripts are available and can provide useful information about the state of such early witnesses. This remark, of course, should be qualified. The access to the early copies of the Quran is still difficult and may explain why this data fails sometimes to be taken into account, in addition to the fact that everybody is not yet very familiar with the new field of scholarship we are speaking about. It is not only the survey I was pleading for earlier that is sorely needed. The access to the documents should be easier. A wide agreement emerged within the scholarly community on the need to provide access to the earliest manuscripts in order to make them available for research. The increase in the number of folios that can be accessed on the web has been dramatic. If we only remember, at least those as old as I am, how difficult it was once to look for comparative material. By the end of the 70s, only a handful of black and white images, most of the time, sometimes in color, were available, but without any precise data about the manuscript. There was no other solution if you wanted to get exact information about a manuscript or a collection, to buy a ticket and go there. And, well, thanks God, I was so able to visit Istanbul for the first time, and I was very happy at that time. But, well, you cannot afford to do that every time you are working on a manuscript, of course. In addition to the digital images of important collections, the facsimile edition of specific copies is transforming the research. Two publication strategies are possible based either on the specific holdings of a given library or on the reconstruction of the original codex, grouping therefore fragments kept in various places together. The first option, which I favored at the beginning for convenience sake, fails to bring clarity in the complex situation of a material largely scattered among various libraries. On the other hand, the editor does not have to worry about the whereabouts of other fragments of the same manuscript that can surface at any moment, as we have seen, as we have been remembered by the 2011 sale of unknown folios from Fustat in Rennes, in Lost Place in France, where all of a sudden this collection of fragments from Fustat were offered for sale. This solution works, of course, better when a large portion of the manuscript is preserved in a single place, as was the case of the St. Petersburg copy A20 published by Efim Rezvan, or the various copies attributed to Osman and published by Tayyar Altekulac. This kind of facsimile may also come as an answer to specific researchers, like the volumes prepared by Syed Murtaza Naqvi, devoted to fragments attributed to Ali ibn Abi Talib or other prominent early Shi'i figures. The second option is scientifically sounder, as fragments preserved in various collections are brought together, thus facilitating further research on this material. The edition of the lower text of the Sana palimpsest by Sadeghi and Goudarzi, or my edition of the Codex Parisino Petropolitanus, are a step in that direction, but in both cases, only a transcription was offered, so the publication of a facsimile is still much needed. The edition of one of the Fustat manuscripts has been prepared along this line as part of the Paleo-Quran project and should be soon available. The much rumored Sana palimpsest is a specific case as far as facsimiles are concerned, and as a second edition of its text prepared by Hilali is about to appear, one has to question the way in which this important witness has to be handled. Both publications, that of Sadeghi and Goudarzi on the one hand, and Hilali on the other, are transcriptions of what these scholars were able to read of the scriptio inferior, that is to say, the text that was written first on the parchment, then erased and covered by the second one. All had access to the same set of photographs, but what they produced was basically a printed transcription. In my opinion, other scholars interested in this complicated document should have the possibility to check the reading with the original as they would with any facsimile. I do hope that a scientifically sound edition of the palimpsest will be soon published thanks to the patient work of Hadia Gurtman, and will provide both images of the folios and a reconstruction of the scriptio inferior, thus serving as a basis for any further discussion of the manuscript. My photograph shows the upper level as a photograph and the reconstructed text drawn by Hadia Gurtman. As I said before, we should not leave aside the material from the 8th and 9th centuries. in addition to their contribution to the history of the text, more precisely to the history of the readings, as I suggested before, they document an extraordinary episode of calligraphy and illumination. Research on the qira'ats of the manuscript is still incipient, and the way in which the specific systems of dots are to be handled should be the subject of some thought before we go further. Sella could anyhow show that towards the middle of the 8th century, the people in charge of dotting a group of copy kept in Fustat were clearly looking for an agreement over a canonical way to recite the Quran, at least on a local basis. So I'm again to my argument of a grassroots level study of the Qira'at and the transmission of the text. The development of a calligraphy that is commonly called Kufic has received already some attention, but a wealth of material has still to be examined, if only to explore its possible contribution to the definition of local workshops. Alain Georges has shown that the scripts he examined in detail were based on the use of a grid, establishing their proportions. Strangely enough, art historians have not been so far interested in the illumination of the Quranic manuscript of Abbasid times. The limitation in the access to the manuscripts may explain why our approach has been mainly classical, if I may say so, that is to say, dominated by philology, codicology, and paleography. The manuscript should also be seen in an anthropological perspective as direct witnesses of the Muslim communities in a crucial period of its history. We should even go further and push for the development of studies of the later handwritten tradition of the Quran. At the beginning of my codicological researches with Arabic manuscripts, I reduced the copies of the Quran to the role of Ariadne's thread through the maze of the Arabic handwritten tradition. However, they require to be studied on their own merits. Here and there, among a material produced over 10 centuries, it's not a mistake, I'm just taking into account the period from the 10th century to the 19th century, only a few points have received some attention. However, these tiny bits show that we have a lot to discover. Should I recall here Fred Lemhuis's analysis of a late manuscript found in Egypt, pointing to the fact that the history of the Qira'at is far more complicated than is commonly assumed, even at a late period. But to this date, there has been almost no organized effort to tackle the issue of this later production, with the exception of Qur'ana, a program devoted to the Quranic manuscripts in the Western Islamic world. Here again, the access to the information and to the documents is still problematic, with catalogs most of the time providing only limited data. Like the medieval Muslim scholars, who were certainly overwhelmed by the diversity of the situation they observed in the old manuscripts, the modern historian of the Quran is trying to grasp the complexity of the early written transmission of the text. In this respect, 30 years after I started working in this field of research and felt, as I recalled at the beginning of this talk, amazed and bewildered by these manuscripts, I still feel to a large extent the same impressions. It's a nice way to say that I feel still very young. Thanks to the work already done on the early copies, an increasing body of evidence can be relied on for further research. The dating is now less problematic than it was half a century ago. The origin of a given copy still eludes us, it's true. I have to underline again that the material found in Damascus, Fustat, Kairouan, or Sana'a has not necessarily been produced locally and may have been imported from another place. Even if the question of the provenance remains pending, the collection of the textual data will soon give us an increasingly precise version of the history of the text itself during the first 3 centuries of Islam. The French-German Paleo-Quran project, that of the Academy of the Sciences of Berlin-Brandenburg, and other such efforts intend to make the access to the documents easier, to provide more contextual information, and to identify significant readings. The interest for the early manuscripts of the Quran, and more widely for the written transmission of the text, is now shared across a wide spectrum of specialists. A foundation active in the research on Arabic manuscripts is organizing next fall a conference on the manuscripts of the Quran, and although I'm not completely at ease with the way in which attendance seems to be approached, I'm delighted to see this development. It is indeed a good sign for various reasons that this impressive and important part of the Muslim world heritage is being treated as a serious scholarly issue, not only for the first centuries, but up to the most recent period. At that point, the question of a scientific edition of the Quran arises. Almost 10 years ago, Fred Donner called for such an enterprise that Gerd Puin labeled an utopia in a paper he published exactly the same year. For Yassin Dutton, the work has already been done in the 7th century, and there is no reason to do it again. It is certainly a thorny issue, if only for ideological reasons, but we are in the end better equipped than ever to start thinking or dreaming about it. I have no doubt that the work that has been done, and above all what is currently done and will be the topic of the next 2 days of this conference, will give us more confidence in that direction. Thank you.